In a galaxy torn by eternal conquests for the rational allocation of forces and resources, every member of human society must be an efficient and fruitful element, bringing benefit to the Imperium. This simple truth, akin to the light of the Emperor, penetrates every remote corner to prevent people from even considering turning towards provoking individualism or the desperate denial of the existing system. Primarchs, the living and especially deadly weapon of the master of mankind, created to protect the realms of men above all others, were to feel their constructive mission and, as reliable tools, play roles of inspiring generals and creators. But what if, among all this agreeable choir, there was someone strong in spirit and mind, accustomed to always resist the influence of the crowd, someone who preferred to go their own way, paying no mind to the disapproving attitudes of those around them, incapable of appreciating the brilliance of his plans due to their limitations? The hero of today's story is Perturabo, the most talented son of the Emperor, capable of building everything except for friendships, and who fell from his own shame. Unlike most of his brothers, the Primarch of the Fourth Legion, snatched from his father's laboratory, was not found by the local inhabitants of the planet where his incubation capsule landed. On the contrary, he himself approached the people, but only after the fame of his wondrous deeds had spread throughout the world. It was said that the strange boy was a phenomenal fighter, despite his age and childish appearance. In addition, incredibly smart and talented. The planet Olympia, which became Perturabo's adoptive home, was at that time a civilized world, presumably settled in the last years of the dark age of technology. Despite its self-sufficiency in most resources, Olympia experienced a shortage of minerals necessary for the production of high-tech equipment and weapons. Once the world had abundant supplies of such materials, but greedy ancestors spent almost all, except for tiny remnants, the amount of which was just enough for Perturabo to later conclude about the civilization's origin on Olympia. The culture and progress on the planet stagnated, remaining at the level of a slave-owning order, and numerous states endlessly waged war with each other over the few fertile territories. Therefore, when rumors of the amazing child traveling between settlements began to emerge, the ruler of one of the city-states, Tyrant Damekos, wisely decided to shelter the boy with him before he became a powerful foe. The warriors, whom the tyrant sent out to search, returned much earlier than expected. Perturabo was found near the edge of the cliff on which the city was located. For a reason known only to him, the boy himself was heading to Lokos. For the first time, finding himself among the majestic buildings that far surpassed anything he had seen before, the little Primarch felt a mixture of wonder and resentment. At his first glance at any splendid edifice, he admired the architect's talent. However, his enthusiasm quickly faded the moment the knowledge in his mind reminded him of the list of necessary formulas and materials needed to erect such a structure. His too perceptive mind deprived the child of the joy of discovery. Yet upon seeing the Damekos Palace towering over the entire city-state, Perturabo was struck with awe. Of course, he also quickly deciphered all the tricks of the building's creators, but the Primarch considered the magnificent view from the high windows onto the land stretching to the horizon as its main virtue. Later, when choosing his apartments in the castle, the remarkable child preferred to live in the most remote tower. Meeting the tyrant, Perturabo showed no slightest reverence or respect for Damekos. He did not hesitate to express his thoughts directly and almost rudely, shocking the guards surrounding the ruler. However, the wise Damekos forgave the boy everything. The ruler rightly assumed that the best option was to keep the remarkable child in Lokos, lest someone else use his genius to their benefit. Wanting to see the child's craftsmanship with his own eyes, the tyrant asked him to demonstrate his blacksmithing skills. Dazzling the onlookers with his speed and dexterity, Perturabo crafted a magnificent sword. Impressed, Damekos offered the boy resources, teachers, and patronage in exchange for his presence at his castle. The ruler saw what a powerful living tool he had in his hands, and was already calculating in his mind the military value of the grown-up alien, blatantly ignoring its other virtues. Perturabo read all this on Damekos's face, and asked whether he would be needed for peaceful or military purposes. The young primarch himself wanted to gift humanity with creations that made people's lives easier, not weapons. The ruler lied, stating that Lokos was not at war, but he did not rule out the possibility of Perturabo's genius being used to create weapons. He then added that, despite his own words about striving for peaceful creation, the boy had still forged a sword. At the time of this meeting, the little primarch looked like a 10-year-old boy and remembered nothing of his past except for the recent events that had brought him to Lokos. Though by his own calculations, Perturabo figured that he had agreed to the deal with Damokos at the age of 6. Hardly having acquired the talented child under the roof of his palace, the tyrant of Lokos immediately began to invite rulers of neighboring states to form alliances which they had previously rejected. Seeing the remarkable boy, promising to grow into a strong warrior and also creating incredible technological inventions, the warring neighbours hurried to agree to a treaty. Perturabo obediently took part in various tests devised by Damokos, demonstrating his exceptional qualities time and time again. He did not enjoy victories, but each time he harboured resentment towards the tyrant for being used as a tool to satisfy the ambitions of others. The ruler of Lokos was not cruel to the young primarch. The trials might involve creating a beautiful portrait of an arriving guest in a few minutes, or a philosophical debate on divinity with a priest. Yet, without once expressing his discontent with the proceedings, Perturabo harboured grievances in his soul. Damokos valued in his ward the talents of an architect and engineer, but said that he liked the boy's oratory abilities the most. The young primarch surpassed all the philosophers on the planet, effortlessly correcting the works of respected elders with his comments and sending them back to the authors. One of them even offered Perturabo to study at his school, but the youth refused, boldly stating that none of the teachers could tell him anything new or useful anymore. The religious society of Olympia saw in Perturabo yet another testament to the existence of the gods and their grand design. However, the youth himself strictly rejected any beliefs. He was convinced that he was not the child of a mortal woman, but, unlike the priests who attributed him to the creation of the gods, he speculated that he was created by someone's design for a certain important purpose. Arguing with a representative of the local cult, the primarch said that he would one day certainly find out who his creator was and prove that he was no god. The infuriated priest, unable to counter Perturabo's rational arguments, desperately cried out about impending retribution. Ironically, the priest's words were not taken seriously by anyone, for he talked nonsense about foreseeing Perturabo becoming the one who would destroy Olympia. 10 years after the first encounter with the tyrant of Lokos, the remarkable child had turned into an adult man. He himself presumed he was no older than 16, though he looked like a 30-year-old warlord, with a black beard and icy eyes. Perturabo spent almost all of his free time in his workshop in the attic, where his only neighbours were several singing birds. The quarters were engulfed in disorder, in which scattered drafts of fantastical mechanisms neighboured with dirty cups and forgotten food, although the primarch himself had no trouble figuring out where everything was in his room. For the serving slaves, the workshop was an inaccessible part of the palace. The youth did not trust the labourers and did not only refuse their help, but also demanded the complete absence of the servants from other family members of the tyrant during his guest visits. Damokos tried many times to find common ground with his ward, but all his attempts were doomed to failure. Perturabo easily lost his temper and stubbornly refused to notice the warmth from those around him. The ruler of Lokos tried to think that such behaviour was typical for teenagers, disrespecting their elders and denying any authorities, but he was genuinely saddened by the sudden grievances so frequently afflicting Perturabo for reasons utterly incomprehensible to those close to him, followed by a coldness that could last for months. Wishing to demonstrate his love to his ward, which the latter stubbornly called a lie, Damokos declared Perturabo his legitimate adopted son on his 16th birthday. The ruler of Lokos deemed his biological sons incapable of wise rule, while his only daughter, Caliphone, would have become the first female tyrant in their state, which could also lead to dire consequences. However, adopting the ward out of calculation by no means implied a lack of fatherly love, but Perturabo only saw the ulterior motive. According to the Olympian traditions, on the 16th birthday, the young man was to undergo a religious naming ceremony. It was expected that Perturabo, in place of his strange self-chosen name, would select for himself the name of one of the ancient heroes, which he, of course, did not do, once again showing his disdain for the religion and traditions of Olympia, and most importantly, for the values held dear by his adoptive father. Even though the youth refused to even explain the meaning of the name, asserting that the tyrant would not understand, Damikos wisely did not argue and compelled the priestesses conducting the naming ritual to use Perturabo's non-Olympian name. Afterward, he noticed a fleeting smile, perhaps the first to visit his son's face in his presence. The young primarch rejoiced in his moral victory over his adoptive father. Besides, the young primarch continued to refer to the tyrant of Lokos exclusively as lord or master, not to show his submission or loyalty, but merely wanting to emphasize that he does not recognize the adoptive father. However, with such behavior besides Damikos, Perturabo also saddened his stepsister Caliphone, the only living soul of Olympia the primarch cared about. For 10 years, the family of the ruler of Lokos reached out to the young man, wishing to fill his life with warmth. But Perturabo rejected the embraces and affection of his so-called relatives and despised what they called love. The primarch was convinced that Damikos valued him only as a unique weapon. The young man's talents for languages helped crack enemy codes, architectural endeavors erected unassailable walls, and engineering perfected weapons of death. Perturabo held all this against his adoptive father, turning it around as if war brought him no pleasure, and at the same time asserting that no one could make him do what he disliked. Damikos endured all the bad antics, although sometimes the screaming son, in anger, forced him to run to the opposite end of the room. Such a prudent measure also seemed offensive to Perturabo. In his opinion, if the adoptive father loved him as his real son, he would trust him and not be afraid of being struck. And yet even in those years it was understood by those around him that when fury clouded the eyes of Perturabo, it was best to keep one's distance. Once he nearly harmed his sister, who was his only friend on Olympia. Despite the harsh words spoken to his adoptive father, the young primarch still cared about those around him and the family that had accepted him. He even invented a special device to test food and drinks for poisons, which were often found at the tables of rulers. Life at the court of a tyrant greatly increased Perturabo's natural suspicion, turning it into near paranoia. Therefore, even with his sister Caliphone, he was unable to establish truly trusting relations. Deep down they both regretted this and secretly dreamed of true warmth, but the primarch's distrust knew no exceptions. The detrimental consequence of such behavior would only become obvious to him many years after leaving Olympia, during his last conversation with his sister. Nevertheless, in his youth, Perturabo, who was so scrupulous about his unusual name, allowed Caliphone to shorten it to simply Beau. After one of his stepbrother's visits to her quarters, Caliphone was taken hostage by sent assassins. Clearly the primary target of the attackers was the mighty adoptive son of the tyrant, and the girl was merely used as a vulnerability to get to him. The primarch had no trouble disposing of the 5 mortals, despite having been wounded by a dagger laced with a potent poison. The one holding the knife at Caliphone's throat was convinced that Perturabo would not attack him, given the risky situation. But the giant, with incredible speed, plucked the poisoned dagger from his shoulder and threw it into the assassin's head. The girl was saved. However, Perturabo's fiery temper triumphed again, and even the last attacker, who could have revealed the client, was destroyed by the enraged primarch. His sister's attempts to stop the avenging hand were in vain. She might as well have tried to move a mountain and nearly became the next victim of blind fury. Coming to his senses, Perturabo realized his mistake and apologized, justifying his anger as being unable to restrain himself due to his concern for Caliphone's life. However, he decided that the assassination attempt could very well have been orchestrated not by enemies, but by family members, stepbrothers, or Damikos. Palace intrigues made Perturabo see enemies everywhere. The fact that his loved ones actually cared for him, he would understand far too late. As the chief general of Damikos, the primarch united the planet under the banners of Lokos. Being the most powerful man on Olympia, he never attempted to overthrow his adoptive father or harm the lords of his native city-state. The same cannot be said for the conquered territories. There, Perturabo gave free rein to his cruelty, no longer hiding his desperate love for warriors and bloodshed. The stern and fearless commander feared nothing, accomplishing one military feat after another. The only thing that instilled fear in his rational heart was the terrifying stellar maelstrom, invisible to anyone but Perturabo. Years later he shared his vision with Ferrus Manus, who failed to comprehend what his newfound brother was speaking of. At that time, almost no one guessed the existence of the nameless abyss in the warp, which Perturabo would later call the Eye of Terror. Moreover, the psychic abilities of the future Primarch of the Fourth Legion manifested in prophetic dreams where he saw his true father. Guided by logic, not faith, Perturabo had long surmised that the creator of an unusual being like him would someday come for his creation, and dreams about the Emperor only confirmed his suspicions. As a child, Perturabo climbed a high crag, where the Lokos was located, coming by himself to the guards of Damekos who were searching for him. To meet the Emperor, the Primarch ascended a 9-kilometer mountain, where the father who appeared overshadowed the light of the terrifying stellar maelstrom with his radiance. The master of mankind came to Perturabo in the guise of a mortal, whom even the kneeling Primarch towered over in height. The Emperor listed all the son's achievements he had seen on Olympia, praised him for his thirst for knowledge, and promised to teach him much. From him emanated warmth and joy, while his wise eyes harboured sadness that the Primarch wished to dispel with his deeds. With reverent tears, the found son swore allegiance to the Emperor, for he had offered to direct his exceptional talents towards serving the human race. Perturabo was happy. Finally, a true loving father had come for him, and he would never again be used as a living weapon or a brilliant tool of war. Upon arriving on Terra, the found Primarch met several of his brothers. However, even among his equals, he could not naturally engage with others. Perturabo considered his inability to make friends a virtue. He believed that whoever earned his trust in return would receive eternal iron loyalty. Yet, as the years would show, even the loyalty of iron could be broken. Still, the suspicious Primarch of the Fourth Legion in the first years after his return under the Emperor's wing managed to establish something akin to almost friendly relations with Magnus the Red. Their bond was formed by a love for learning and a thirst to discover the new. Together the Primarchs laboured for several months at the excavations of one of the human worlds, destroyed in the Age of Strife. Magnus was more interested in the esoteric and philosophical works of the sages of the vanished world, while Perturabo busied himself with studying the lost mechanical wonders of antiquity. All of the Emperor's sons demonstrated an amazing ability to learn and showed high intelligence relative to mortals, yet it became clear from the very first days of Perturabo's arrival on Terra that he was the most gifted Primarch in terms of absolute scientific knowledge and technical inventions. And yet, most of his work remained comprehensible only to Perturabo. In creating anything beautiful and useful, as on Olympia, he refused to explain the details, deeming those who were curious incapable of understanding, even if another Primarch inquired about the future invention. The Emperor did not perceive any problem in his son's aloofness and coldness towards others. He was pleased to have acquired a new death-dealing weapon for his great crusade, and saw in Perturabo a mighty warlord whose ferocious power was eclipsed only by his sharp intellect. To the young Primarch, every battle was merely a problem that needed to be defined and overcome. Soon after his first meeting with the father, he would demonstrate to the enemies of the Imperium the terrible force of his deadly mind. Before departing on his first campaign under the banners of the Imperium, Perturabo ascended to the top of the Astartes Tower to take an oath of allegiance to the Master of Mankind, just as the other previously discovered Primarchs had done. Every step required superhuman effort of will and bravery. It was not merely a physical ascent, but a challenge to the intellect and heart, a psychic interaction with the Emperor himself, who tested the furthest limits of his son's endurance. Perturabo assumed command of the Fourth Legion of Space Marines, which he named the Iron Warriors, and ordered the recruitment of new aspirants from his homeworld of Olympia. Remarkably, this world joined the Imperium much more quickly and efficiently than many others, hoping that life under the Emperor's rule would raise their existence even higher than Perturabo had with his technologies. By the time the Iron Warriors were handed over to their primarch, the Legion had about 35,000 Space Marines. However, after reviewing the history of their military operations, Perturabo was disappointed. In his opinion, the Legion and its brothers had achieved incomparably greater feats, meaning the disgraced sons needed to be punished. The method of punishment came to him from the harsh Olympian traditions, which the Primarch had previously so fervently rejected. Decimation, a procedure well known to the 12th Legion of Angron, representing a voluntary, shameful death for every 10th Space Marine. However, if the cruel Primarch of the 12th used it as a punishment for failure, Perturabo resorted to decimation simply because his sons were not as flawless as he wished them to be. The Iron Lord believed that war is indifferent, relentless and blind, and therefore the payment for weakness must be the same, blind, random and ruthless. Those who were ordered by the father to pay the bloody sacrifice were forced by their Legion brothers to be killed with bare hands, so that the shameful and bitter death would forever be imprinted in the hearts of the survivors. Upon learning what had happened, many members of the Emperor's court expressed their protest, believing that the 4th Legion had mistakenly become a bloodthirsty madman. Other justifications for the Primarch's brutal actions were his loyalty to the traditions of Olympia, suggesting he only needed time to understand the cultural values of the Imperium before leading the Iron Warriors. Robert Guilliman was among the most vocal, outraged by the shameful and unjust deaths of valiant warriors who fought shoulder to shoulder with his Ultramarines. This sowed the first seeds of enmity between the two Primarchs, fertilized by the Emperor's complete disregard for the decimation of the 4th Legion. However, the Iron Warriors themselves learned the lesson well, understanding that Perturabo's rule would be merciless, unforgiving, without patronage or playing favourites, and death would be the payment for any lapse. For their father, war was merely a curious equation. They were punished not for a mistake or failure in the Great Crusade before the Primarch's arrival. No, their fault, in Perturabo's view, was that his sons had not reached their full potential. Good Astartes warriors were not enough for him. The Iron Lord wanted his legion to be recognized as the best among all others. His interactions with subordinates, including the high captains within his trident, vividly showcase the Primarch's arrogant and cruel nature. For some reason, Perturabo deemed it necessary to demean those around him repeatedly, speaking of his greatest mind's unattainability for the primitive Space Marines. Although everyone was already well aware of this, the Iron Lord's harsh methods and sombre example awakened suspicion, malicious distrust, and a calloused indifference to the lives of others in the hearts of the Astartes of the 4th Legion. This created a rift between the Iron Warriors and the other legions, a division that Perturabo relished, emphasizing the unique resolve and ruthlessness of his sons. The 4th Legion was more often than not deployed for siege attacks, relying on the effective interaction of the Primarch's genius with the strength and self-sacrifice of the Space Marines. The Iron Lord's willingness to sacrifice everything for victory led to the heaviest losses among the forces participating in the Great Crusade. Neglect and disdain from their father, along with the constant and futile deaths, led even these enhanced warriors, resistant to psychological shocks, down a path slowly and agonizingly, drawing them toward catastrophe. Imperial army soldiers, unfortunate enough to fight under Perturabo's command, were doomed. The Primarch used human resources not as auxiliary forces, but as deliberate expendables. Cannon fodder to deplete enemy firepower, thousands in sacrificial waves, just to time how long it took for opponents to eliminate a certain number of mortal soldiers. Such repeated incidents tarnished the reputation of the 4th Legion, with soldiers even revolting before battles, unwilling to be treated as expendable. Their rebellions were swiftly quelled by Space Marines time and again, yet when the rumours reached the War Master, he commanded Perturabo to hand over all human units and henceforth use condemned criminals for such tactics, in order not to undermine the warriors' morale. Throughout the decades of the Great Crusade, the Iron Warriors managed to create negative relations with nearly every other Space Marine legion. The Raven Guard despised them after a cycle of joint battles in a continuous war. The Imperial Fists were in constant fierce rivalry with them, and the White Scars and Space Wolves referred to the Fourth Legion in their chronicles as a nameless ally. Even though their joint victory against the Orcs was achieved solely thanks to the genius of Perturabo. In retrospect, this constantly growing rift between the brothers seems more apparent than it appeared to contemporaries. But after Horus was named War Master, the position of the Iron Warriors began to deteriorate even more rapidly. There is a belief that the Emperor assigned Perturabo the most challenging missions, knowing that no one other than him could tackle such tasks. At the same time, the arch-traitor continued to assign the Fourth Legion to the most difficult battles, but with the aim of undermining his brother's morale, hastening his fall. Moreover, Horus's orders divided the Iron Warriors, sending them to different ends of the galaxy in a multitude of expeditions. For instance, to bring one of the worlds into compliance, only 10 Space Marines were sent, while the planet had a population of 130 million people. Other primarchs, such as Leman Russ, Vulcan, and Magnus the Red, refused the order to divide their warriors, but Perturabo silently complied. As before, he silently did what he disliked, but only to harbour resentment. The Iron Warriors turned into garrison forces with numerous dislocations across the entire Imperium, and their undisputed success in sieges led to the Fourth Legion being automatically assigned to all siege missions, ignoring the Astartes' need for rest or reorganization. Perceiving his brother as an unparalleled demolisher of fortifications, the other Primarchs forgot that, among other things, he possessed a unique mind and a sense of beauty. The Iron Lord was not the greatest psyker, deeply understanding the flow of the warp like Magnus, or a gifted swordsman like Fulgrim. Perturabo's main strength and simultaneous misfortune was that his boundless genius was underestimated. The Primarch could discuss the nuances of the most advanced technologies with the highest Adeptus Mechanicus, being not just a skilled master but a creator. In addition, over the years of service to the Emperor, Perturabo amassed a grand collection of masterpieces, surpassing the libraries of Guilliman and Magnus. It contained countless works of art, scrolls with images of marvellous inventions and blueprints of architectural wonders created by the Primarch. There were designs for luxurious amphitheatres, the industrial infrastructure of vast hive cities, impregnable citadels, and richly decorated palaces, capable of rivaling the mountain stronghold of the Emperor himself. No architect of the galaxy could have ever imagined the structure that Perturabo calculated and designed. For any other creator, such constructions would have seemed miraculous, but not the fruit of a genius mind. But the Iron Warlord was associated with destruction and death, not with the creation of something new. Hence, had a stranger found his way into his treasure trove, they would never have thought that all the astounding projects on the drafting tables came from the hand of the father of the Fourth Legion. Though one of Perturabo's greatest projects was indeed realized. The splendid amphitheatre he authored was used for the Council of Nicaea. The Primarch had envisioned it as a stage for athletic contests, but the arena became a place of condemnation. Despite the amphitheatre being demolished shortly after the decree was issued, Perturabo forever remembered Nicaea as his own shameful defeat and disgrace by the Emperor. The genius of the Primarch was not limited to the drafting board. He also created hundreds of unusual machines, various decorations and trinkets of astonishing design, seemingly impossible to model. There were musical instruments made of precious metals adorned with shining stones, reminiscent of what in ancient times would have been called Fabergé eggs, miniature war machines, moving models of animals, humans and xenos, as well as almost mythical bird cages, in which Perturabo's avian companions would never feel restricted in freedom. Only members of his trident were allowed into this Primarch's trove, and no one besides them knew about the existence of this wondrous place. Perturabo liked this. He secretly harboured a sense of beauty in his soul. Although in the early years after his rediscovery, the Primarch behaved differently. During that period he created the Golden Lion, which was never destined to reach the father of the Dark Angels, Lionel Johnson, and the Celestial Ore, which Roboute Guilliman installed at the tallest tower of his Temple of Correction on Macragge. But after natural secrecy and suspicion overcame the initial joy of meeting his true family, and Perturabo again distanced himself from everyone, just as he did in his workshop on Olympia. The Iron Warlord mastered many languages of the Xenos, including several dialects of Eldar, and the guttural bark with which orcs communicated among themselves. Attention to detail accompanied Perturabo throughout his life. He revelled in counting the minutiae in any endeavour, whether it was the demolition of an enemy fortress or establishing the golden ratio in his new work. Angron considered this a pointless waste of time, while Roboute Guilliman, on the contrary, praised such meticulousness. Two such dissimilar primarchs, who assessed Perturabo's activities oppositely, were right in their own way. But none of them realized how bitter and uncompromising the demands of the Iron Lord were towards himself. The Primarch showed cruelty towards his sons, but demanded 100-fold more from himself. All his works had to be perfected as long as they existed, and each task was performed with such diligence by the Master as if it could be his last in life. Remarkably, in the Fourth Legion, the cruel customs inherited from Olympia thrived, and the Primarch himself resorted to the traditions or words brought from his native world. Although, while in Locus, under the authority of his foster father, he merely rejected the local culture. An example of this is the Logos, the Terminator armour of Perturabo, personally constructed by him and named in tune with the city-state in which the Iron Lord was raised. Besides providing a phenomenal level of protection, the armour supported intricate command systems, linking the Primarch with all units under his command, included various types of weapons, also created by Perturabo, a controller for managing automata, and the Homer teleport. Given how much armour means to a warrior, it can be suggested that by naming it after his homeland, the Primarch wanted to emphasise not just his origin, but also his warm feelings towards the past on Olympia. Subsequent events only confirmed this. Over 1.5 centuries of service to the Emperor, Perturabo carried out numerous complex operations, the last of which was the purification of several planets in the Sactrada deeps from the Hrud. These Xenos are a loathsome and dangerous species, parasitizing on other races. They are rarely recognizable by appearance, as Hruds prefer to wrap themselves in long robes, completely concealing their outlines. The bodies of the Xenos produce a poison, adapting to the species inhabiting the planet. Nonetheless, they do not engage in open wars and often just create settlements in dark caves, where they sort through their precious junk, constantly carrying it with them, guarding it from thieves. For the population of a world colonized by Hruds, the Xenos do not pose a sharp threat, however. Once they occupy a certain territory, the aliens start to consider all nearby humans as their property. Meanwhile, the habitats of the Hruds gradually become polluted and toxic due to the substances they spread. In history, there are even mentioned cases when humans, having lived near the Xenos for a long time, died after parting with them due to a lack of toxins to which they had become accustomed. But the most dangerous ability of the Hruds is the entropic field generated by their bodies. The presence of these Xenos causes objects to rapidly deteriorate and people to age, turning into elders or conversely rejuvenating to infancy. Since colonies usually become caves, slums and other unpopular places, the human population rarely feels such a devastating impact. However, during mass migrations, the gathering of the Hrud itself becomes a weapon, destroying everything in its path. For this reason, this species is considered a top-tier Xeno threat. In cleansing planets of the Hrud, the Iron Warriors encountered a true nightmare, capable of depriving not only of life but also of sanity. Solar storms, tectonic instability, rifts in space and time, and even a planet destroyed by the Xenos, parts of which they eventually used to hide from the Imperial forces, are not as frightening as what happened to the warriors themselves during the battles. Time-controlling enemies could stop it for a specific Astartes for a century, thus ripping his mind out of the battle and hurling it back in. A disoriented space marine lost concentration and perished. Other temporifexes, on the other hand, accelerated events or swapped moments, turning the unfolding events into a mad kaleidoscope of chaotic frames. Swords touching the blades of the Xenos crumbled into dust, and the bodies of the warriors of the Imperium, pierced by the enemy, changed their shape and exploded. Some space marines, caught in a zone of temporal distortion, rapidly rejuvenated, gaining a momentary burst of vigor and power, only to immediately die in agony from implant rejection. Understanding how difficult the confrontation with such an enemy would be, Perturabo personally led the offensive. His immaculate armor dimmed, but did not decompose under the influence of the tempora ferox, and the body and face of the primarch showed no signs of aging. The Hruds were not invulnerable. They were killed by bolters, swords, and even the bare hands of the Astartes. But the genius of the primarch did not stop at mere brute force. In conjunction with the Mechanicum, he developed a weapon that reversed the fabric of time relative to the setting defined by the Xenos. This invention not only protected the Space Marines from the destructive influence, but also massacred the Hrud. Yet, it was not possible to completely destroy the tempora ferox. They tore the planet apart, turning the capital into a flying island, and vanished, slicing a hole in space. The backlash from their jump scattered the fleet of the Iron Warriors expedition across a radius of 1 astronomical unit. All ships lost motion and some even exploded. Silently watching as his sons die, the Primarch thought only of one thing. This senseless and bloody war is solely to indulge the Emperor's vanity. Despite these thoughts, Perturabo was enraged by the outcome of the battles and vented his dissatisfaction by humiliating the commanders he deemed responsible for the defeat. The subordinates knew that in such moments it was wisest to stay out of the Primarch's field of vision, lest they become the next victim of his precipitate rage. Yet some were tasked with the suicidal role of messengers, bringing ill tidings. An officer of the Imperial Army, assigned the task to convey the news of his native Olympia's betrayal to Perturabo, knew he would not return alive. And so it happened. The Primarch tore him apart with his bare hands, barely as the unfortunate soul finished his sentence. The arrogance of the Iron Lord stemmed from his pride for the harsh native world he saw as exemplary. With incredible effort, the Primarch restrained his desire to kill everyone on the ship. Olympia's defiance seemed to him a personal dishonor. Sacrificing the forces needed to pursue the Xenos, Perturabo directed his fleet towards his homeworld. It is believed that the fallen Horus intentionally arranged troubles for the 4th Legion's expedition, including sparking the fire of rebellion on Olympia in order to more quickly disillusion his brother and sway him to his side. However, the world's inhabitants explained their disobedience with objective reasons. According to them, the better life promised by the Imperium had not materialized. Instead, it had become only worse. Minor quarrels, prevalent on the planet in the past, occasionally claimed the lives of dozens of warriors. But with the coming of the Emperor, Olympia began to lose thousands of young people annually. The populace disapproved of their children being taken, altered, and led to death for wars on unknown worlds. In the eyes of mortals, the Space Marines born to them became mere expendable material for the Imperium, not heroes, as the propaganda claimed. For 150 years, Olympia existed submissively under the wing of the Emperor, but the fire of rebellion erupted as soon as the tyrant Damikos died. Upon arriving at the planet, Perturabo first organized a meeting with the leaders of the protests, from whom he heard all their grievances. Despite the Olympians not desiring open confrontation and being ready for compromise, explaining everything by their desperate situation, the Primarch remained true to his cruelty. Perturabo was enraged the moment he heard news of the uprising, but the ingratitude of his homeworld ultimately blinded him. The selfish Olympians cared for their planet, as if they considered it their own, merely because it was where the Primarch was found. The Iron Lord was furious at the thought that Olympia did not appreciate his greatest contribution to the protection of humanity. He fought in the darkness of space, saving the galaxy from monstrous Xenos, but people did not understand this. Had they been able to see even one of the nightmare worlds cleansed by Perturabo, they would have willingly given him their children. But such was beyond the understanding of mortals, and the Primarch ordered the planet to be punished. The part of the Iron Lord's mind that had once sensibly guided his actions had by that moment lost its influence. In the eyes of the envoys who came for negotiations, a city was incinerated, and a familiar verdict was announced to the whole planet: decimation. Perturabo decreed that the regions must voluntarily put to death every 10th inhabitant. Nonetheless, should the Iron Warriors not see the funeral pyres upon approaching the city gates, half of the population will be exterminated by the hands of the Astartes, and the city will be burned. The leaders of the uprising were beheaded, and their heads sent back to their allies. Olympia was ablaze with countless fires of burning settlements. Towers and walls, once thought impregnable and built by Perturabo himself, were being destroyed by his own hands. Furthermore, the local army had nothing to counter the Iron Warriors. The Space Marines, driven mad by decades of inglorious battles and constant humiliation, following the example of their father, saw the betrayal of their homeland as the last straw. The legionaries slaughtered people, set homes ablaze, and mercilessly killed brothers who tried to stop the insane bloodshed. Few had the mental fortitude to disobey the monstrous order. Some Astartes, entering the dwellings of mortals, noticed the poverty reigning in the homes of the commoners. A whole family's interrupted dinner could consist only of a few pieces of bread. The Space Marines involuntarily recalled their childhood on Olympia and the talks of a better life for the homeland that motivated the recruiters. As the rebels had said, the Imperium brought nothing to the common people but more losses. Attempting to share these thoughts with their legion brothers, the enlightened Astartes invariably died as traitors. The last bastion in Perturabo's path was his native Lokos. The city was fortified better than any other on the planet, and was considered virtually impregnable. High walls constructed by the Primarch himself surrounded it on 3 sides, and on the 4th was a steep cliff with a single road, which the inhabitants blew up. The Iron Lord took the city with grim pleasure. It was as if he was opposing himself, once again demonstrating unmatched genius, and yet again destroying the wonders he had created. Finding himself in the tyrant's castle, Perturabo headed to the hall, where his adoptive father, Damokos, found his last rest. The dead tyrant in the transparent coffin appeared majestic and proud, rather than cunning and calculating, as the young Primarch had seen him. At that moment, the Iron Lord for the first time addressed Damokos, calling him father, with bitterness, realizing that the deceased no longer needed his belated feelings. However, Perturabo was heard. His named sister Caliphone was in the room's darkness. The Primarch immediately recognized her, though he saw before him a withered old woman, not the beautiful maiden he had once almost loved. Such warm feelings he had experienced only for the Emperor throughout his life. But the sister had changed not just outwardly. Cheerful and cunning in the past, now she was sarcastic and cold, as if unforgiving of Perturabo for something. Caliphone reacted with a smirk to the fact that after a century and a half, her stepbrother had finally recognized her and Damokos as his kin. She told the Primarch that she had been mistaken to consider him a gift of the gods, because in reality her stepbrother was their punishment. The Iron Lord could not be hurt by such words, for he never heeded religious reflections. However, there is a belief that the misfortunes that befell Perturabo and his sons stemmed in part from a militant denial. Throughout his life, the Primarch rejected all belief systems, guided solely by logic, yet the imperial truth also failed to resonate with him. The Iron Lord and his warriors found themselves as those who did not know for what they had been fighting for many decades. In that conversation, the Primarch asked his sister about the fate of another brother of hers, Andos, whom he secretly considered better than himself. A mortal son of a tyrant could have been considered the most gifted creator of Olympia had not Perturabo been there, but Andos, possessing harmony and peace in his soul, never envied him. Caliphona informed that her own brother renounced any claims to the throne and lived his life labouring in his workshop, where he died peacefully many years ago. Such a happy fate was unavailable to the Primarch. a simple mortal. Sharing with his sister his disappointment in the ideas of the master of mankind, Perturabo compared the Imperium to his dreams of the greatest buildings for an ideal society. Realizing the futility of everything he had done throughout his life, the Iron Lord did not notice as he allowed himself to shed a tear. All the pain that ever troubled him, the disdain of his brothers, the coldly calculating nature of his father, the constant limitation of his own potential, and the feeling of abandonment by all, overwhelmed him at once. Perturabo hated this momentary weakness for mourning, not his shattered dreams, but himself. But Califona did not pity him, calling him weak instead. For decades the woman had followed all her brother's campaigns, observing as the most troubling aspects of Perturabo's personality grew and overshadowed his virtues. The Primarch thought that the Emperor did not value him and therefore sent him on the most difficult missions. On the contrary, Califona believed that the Emperor placed her brother above the others and entrusted him with complex tasks, understanding that no one else could perform better. The Iron Lord justified his ruthlessness and uncompromising nature with efficiency, contrasting it with the weakness of others. Califona explained this as his desire to appear before the others as a martyr. Perturabo allowed his legion to be divided, silently accepted every command, and executed each mission in the most excruciating way, hoping others would appreciate how much he sacrificed himself and his sons. Since his teen years, the Primarch distanced himself from those around him, hiding from his first family in the attic, and then from the second within the depths of his flagship's workshop. However, he did this not because he did not need society, but in the hope that someone would recognize the diamond of his genius in this darkness, and admire how hard Perturabo worked without a single complaint. Califona blamed her stepbrother for never growing up into a man, remaining forever a resentful teenager. In the opinion of the tyrant's daughter, it was this, not the emperor or human uprisings, that led to the destruction of Olympia. In her final phrase, Califona managed to say that Perturabo, who vividly depicted contempt for love, actually craved it above all else for his entire life, but never received it due to his own pathetic selfishness. Therefore, in Califona's eyes, the most intelligent Primarch turned out to be the biggest fool among all she had met. Enraged, Perturabo strangled his sister with his own hands. However, even in those moments when life was leaving her body, the Primarch did not see fear or contempt in the woman's eyes, only pity. At first he wanted to tear the dead crone into many pieces, but when the wave of anger subsided, the Primarch shivered in disgust at his own action. He had killed the only person who was dear to him and destroyed his native Olympia. At the moment of realization, Perturabo felt his soul crack under the weight of overwhelming shame. The Primarch imagined what his brothers would say upon learning of what happened, and understood that Califona was right. He so desired to hear praise that, repeatedly facing indifference, he unwittingly set himself the goal of earning at least condemnation. "The Emperor will never forgive me." The Iron Lord endlessly repeated this phrase as if in a trance. He was sure that now there were no ways back. Soon, the desolated Olympia received news of Prospero being burned with the sons of Lemonruss and the treacherous activities of Horus on Istvan III. A civil war was flaring up in the galaxy. By the Emperor's order, the Iron Warriors were sent to Istvan V to support the loyal forces. But by that day, Perturabo had already sided with the arch-traitor, who promised never to reproach the brother for the destruction of Olympia. After the victory in the drop site massacre, Horus decided to reward the Iron Lord with a battle hammer, Forgebreaker, once forged by Fulgrim for Ferrus Manus. This gift, in the fallen warrior's intention, was to become a symbol of the Iron Warriors and their father Horus's devotion, and many considered the hammer to be the binding part of the Primarch's agreement. Only Perturabo knew that what really bound them was the promised forgiveness for Olympia. Among the Primarchs, nobody resembled the father of the Fourth Legion as much as Rogel Dawn, both distinguished by silence and unyielding similar war methods, aspirations for creation. But despite what seemed like common views on the world, Perturabo and Rogel hated each other almost from their first meeting. The Iron Lord probably considered himself more worthy of the role that the Emperor had allocated to Dawn. And soon after the slaughter on Istvan V, the Iron Warriors had an opportunity to take revenge on the 7th Legion for the offences inflicted. Preparing for the defence of Terra, Rogel Dawn ordered all parts of his legion to arrive at the Throne World. However, a contingent of the Imperial Fists, located on the planet Hydrodomitus, could not leave their base due to the sudden death of their navigator. Then the Iron Warriors attacked the world with intense bombardment, and afterwards they landed on the surface along with their primarch. The rivers boiled from magmatic bombs, and the fertile fields turned into scorched deserts, but the citadel of the 7th Legion remained untouched. With such precision, Perturabo once again wanted to demonstrate his superiority over the enemy. However, thanks to the skill of ancient builders and the courage of the defenders, the fortress withstood nearly 3 months of siege. On the day when the defence fell, the Iron Warriors killed 52 Space Marines of the Imperial Fists, as well as 13,000 mortal men and women who were sheltering in the citadel. Perturabo personally killed 30 of the Astartes. The Iron Warriors scoured the planet, turning the few survivors into slaves. Soon after this victory on Hydra Caudatus, the sons of the Emperor arrived, led by their primarch Fulgrim. The Iron Lord was not on friendly terms with the Phoenician, as with his other brothers, but respected him for his pursuit of perfection. Throughout his life, Perturabo strove towards the same goal, and thus agreed to cooperate, considering Fulgrim a reliable ally. The father of the Iron Warriors assumed that his brother wanted to propose a joint effort to conquer Mars, as Horus needed the forged cities and the support of the Mechanicum. The capture plan promised to be yet another masterpiece of Perturabo's genius, in which the Emperor's children would play the role of allies to the Iron Warriors. But Fulgrim had entirely different plans. The Phoenician proposed to his brother to embark on a search for a wondrous weapon, capable of bringing to life all the designs of the Iron Lord and ensuring they never disappoint. In addition to this, the father of the 4th Legion was presented with a magnificent stoat cape with a precious stone on the clasp. Fulgrim said that by joining forces, the 2 legions would find what they desired more quickly, and thus bring Horus's victory closer. Perturabo was skeptical of the Phoenix's words, but upon hearing that the weapon lay within a warp storm, changed his mind. According to Fulgrim, the ancient Xenos weapon Angel Exterminatus was so powerful that the stars themselves shifted around it, forming a vortex, which the Iron Lord named the Eye of Terror. This terrifying phenomenon had haunted Perturabo from his earliest years. He had seen it in the sky above every conquered planet, and only on the day of his first meeting with the Emperor did the oppressive occurrence dissolve, giving way to the dark sky. The primarch of the Iron Warriors recalled how he shared his troubling vision with Ferrus Manus, but in his brother's look he read only contempt and an accusation of weakness. Since then, he had spoken of the Eye of Terror to no one, and now Fulgrim himself had proposed to venture into the warp storm with an expedition. Perturabo felt a sense of relief upon arriving at the boundary of the Eye of Terror. Others could see it too, albeit somewhat differently than the Primarch. Looking at the rift, the Iron Lord felt the screams of swallowed worlds, the moments of their fall flashing before his eyes in phantom images. I have seen planets plunged into madness, where the laws of physics ceased to function. It was then that the greatest storm of the galaxy of those years received its name. The planet Idris, once one of the crown worlds of the Eldar in ancient times, became the destination within the Eye of Terror. Its surface was almost untouched by the warp storm, and so the Iron Warriors, with precision bombardment, destroyed everything around the citadel that was to be the final point of the expedition, where, according to calculations, the tomb of the Angel Exterminatus was located. The Eldar on the planet engaged in resistance against the forces from 2 regions, but were crushed. Perturabo and Fulgrim personally led their warriors. The Phoenician did not challenge the dominant role of his brother in this battle, but constantly urged him on. On the way to the tomb, the Iron Lord carefully examined the appearance of Fulgrim and his Astartes. Already at their meeting on Hydra Caudatus, the Third Legion had struck him with its vile vulgarity. But now to this was added a strange pallor. Fulgrim radiated a strange, seemingly lethal glow, which clearly had no place inside a living being. Perturabo didn't trust his brother at all, considering him the most unreliable ally of Horus, but still decided to see the search to its end. The traitor's forces were suddenly attacked by numerous elder automatons. But even fighting for their lives, the Iron Lord noted how Fulgrim slipped away in the heat of battle. The Primarch followed his brother down an endless staircase to a glowing point of light in the distance. It turned out that Idris was a hollow planet with a colossal void and a bright sun instead of a core. Perturabo was enraged, realizing the self-obsessed Fulgrim's lie. The angel exterminatus never existed. The Iron Lord attempted to strike the Phoenician, but he was brought to his knees by merely one monstrous word that tore apart his mind. The precious stone adorning the cloak, gifted to Perturabo by the Phoenixes, drained the iron strengths of the bearer, sacrificing them on the altar of Fulgrim's ascension. The father of the Iron Warriors tried to see in the eyes of his brother a hint of remorse or shame for the intent to sacrifice to his ambitions, but saw there only the desire to become a god. Perturabo threw the stone, killing him into the abyss, and attacked the Phoenician with the Forge Breaker. Ironically, the blow that split Fulgrim's mortal shell was delivered by a hammer forged by him hundreds of years ago. The Phoenix's armour evaporated, and he soared upward in a stream of light, for a few moments becoming as pure and flawless as before his fall, but only to transform before the shocked Perturabo into a serpentine horned monster. As soon as the transformation was completed, the Emperor's children along with their Primarch disappeared in teleportation flashes, leaving the Iron Warriors on the crumbling planet. The Fourth Legion played a significant role in the Siege of Terra, where Perturabo had the opportunity to demonstrate his genius abilities in the destruction of fortifications created by Rogel Dawn. Despite the pride and obsession that consumed the Primarch of the Fourth Legion, he remained the most rational ally of the Arch-Traitor. Angron and Fulgrim were preoccupied with their passions. Magnus was absent, and Kurtze remained an unreliable madman, while only Perturabo focused on organizing the attack on the Imperial Palace. The Iron Lord never had the chance to find out whether his talents or those of Rogel Dawn were more adept, as Horus fell before the defense of Terra. Thus, the confrontation between the Primarch of the Fourth and the Seventh Legion continued. On the planet Sebastus IV, Perturabo built a citadel trap for the father of the Imperial Fists, which he called the Eternal Fortress. However, the traitor's triumph went down in history as the battle for the Iron Cage. Learning of the fortifications built by his brother, Dawn declared that he would crush the defences and return Perturabo to Terra in an iron cage. Robuta Gilliman offered his help in the siege, but the Praetorian was too proud to accept it. Such a reckless decision cost Rogel Dawn dearly. The Iron Lord not only surpassed him, but he did so in a manner that made the brother and his legion feel the maximum humiliation. For 3 weeks the blood-drained Imperial Fists fought because of their own father's stubbornness, deciding not to retreat until death. Their complete annihilation was prevented by the arrival of Robut Gilliman and the fact that Perturabo delayed the final blow, wishing to torment his hated brother as long as possible. The Iron Lord did not want to fight 2 legions at once, and focused all efforts on preventing Dawn from evacuating the wounded from the battlefield and retrieving the gene seed of the dead. This undermined the Legion of Imperial Fists, depriving them of the ability to fight for the next 19 years. The stolen gene codes were offered to the Dark Gods as a sacrifice, elevating the father of the Iron Warriors to a demon prince of chaos, undivided. There is a theory that states Perturabo, always thinking and acting contrary to others, had no firm ground for forming his own beliefs, only rejecting existing ones but never suggesting an alternative. Such reasoning leads to the conclusion that the mantle of Primarch for him was simply a license for mass murder, a tendency that manifested early on. One can long argue how exactly a talented young man reached such a disgraceful end over 200 years. But the truth is that sometimes no cataclysmic event is needed for someone to silently turn into a monster.